I was adjusting a mannequin when the text came in, short, smug, and explosive. I'm leaving you. Moving to LA with Kelsey. I emptied the joint account. Good luck. No warning.
No conversation.
Just a digital gut punch from the man I'd spent 11 years married to. My hand didn't even shake as I put the phone down. I smiled and handed a scarf to a regular customer like nothing had happened. Outside, downtown Asheville buzzed with its usual Friday energy. Inside, I felt something colder than rage settle in. I'd known something was off. Dean's sudden obsession with the gym, his work trips, the way he started calling my boutique just a little hobby. But this was war in a text message. And here's the real kicker. He thought he'd won. What kind of man thinks he can rob his wife and vanish into the sunset with a 22-year-old and no consequences? Did he really believe I was that blind or that weak? He had no idea what I'd seen and what I'd been preparing for months. Dean's betrayal didn't blindside me. It confirmed what I already knew. The late nights, the evasive answers, the mysterious credit card charges from hotels I'd never stepped foot in. I wasn't naive. I was patient. 2 months earlier, I'd met with a lawyer and laid everything out, quietly, methodically. I opened a new business account in a separate bank, moved my personal savings, and had my boutique's finances reviewed and locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Every receipt, every suspicious deposit, every change in his behavior, I had documented it all. And while Dean had been gloating over his grand escape, I'd already changed the locks on the accounts, canceled the cards, and rerouted the money trail. The only thing he'd drained was a decoy account I'd let him believe was our main stash. That weekend, while he and Kelsey were supposedly boarding a flight to LA, they discovered their tickets had been canceled and their hotel reservation erased. I'd reported the charges as fraudulent, with his own texts as evidence. But I didn't gloat. I didn't send a message back. I let the silence sit. Because I knew the next message he'd receive would come from a process server with divorce papers. And that's when I realized Dean hadn't just underestimated me. He'd lit the match that would ignite the best chapter of my life. I didn't hear from Dean for almost 48 hours. Not a call, not a single text. But I imagined the scene perfectly. Him standing at the check-in counter with Kelsey, trying to charm his way out of a denied boarding pass. Credit card declined, flashing red on the screen. Hotel concierge apologizing as they're turned away. He thought he'd caught me off guard. What he didn't know was that I'd been 2 steps ahead for months. When I found that receipt for dinner for 2, on a night he claimed to be in Charlotte for meetings, I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I opened a new savings account the very next morning. When he casually suggested putting his name on the deed to the house my aunt had left me, I smiled and changed the topic. I didn't need a fight. I needed a clean strategy. And now, sipping the Cabernet I'd been saving for a special occasion. Turns out, liberation tastes like blackberry and oak. I'd never thought of myself as calculating. I was the peacemaker, the steady hand, and the records, every cent that passed through our lives, were now organized into tidy folders labeled evidence. By Monday morning, Dean had finally found the nerve to text. It was a mix of arrogance and panic. I know you're angry. Let's just split things fair and move on. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I didn't respond. My attorney did. By noon, he'd been served at the cheap motel he was now calling home. And as I watched the sun rise through the boutique window that day, its golden light stretching over a display of new handbags, I realized something. I hadn't lost anything. I'd simply removed the one thing holding me back. 3 weeks after the papers were served, Dean finally showed up in court, looking nothing like the man who once prided himself on polished suits and smug confidence. He wore jeans that hung awkwardly off his frame and a blazer that still had a clearance tag peeking out from under the sleeve. Kelsey wasn't with him, according to the court clerk. She'd waited outside, visibly uncomfortable and glued to her phone. When I walked into the courtroom, I didn't even glance his way. My lawyer had already warned me, stay calm. We're holding every card. And we were. I had a binder thick with evidence, screenshots of his gloating texts, financial records showing every dime he took. and a paper trail proving the boutique's ownership was mine, and mine alone. Dean's lawyer tried to spin it, said I was calculating, that I'd weaponized preparation. But when did being smart and self-protective become a crime? The judge wasn't impressed with Dean's casual admissions of draining the account or using the joint credit card to fund a luxury escape with his intern lover. I watched Dean squirm as the judge read the text where he said, "I'm leaving you. Good luck." Then, the one that really sealed it. "By the way, I used the joint card for our flights and hotel. Consider it my parting gift. LOL. The judge looked up slowly, deadpan. "Is that your idea of financial responsibility, Mr. Cooper?" Dean muttered something about needing a clean break. The judge didn't even blink. "Then I suggest you start by repaying what you stole." Outside the courtroom, I passed Kelsey in the hallway. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I noticed her wiping away mascara smudges as she scrolled her phone with trembling fingers. I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel sorry either. I just felt done. Finished with all of it. Dean had gambled everything on the assumption that I'd fall apart, that I'd let him walk away with half of what I built. Instead, he walked out owing me money, with no house, no business, and no girlfriend willing to stick around through the fallout. I returned to my boutique that afternoon to find a bouquet of wildflowers from a customer and a note that read, "For the woman who reminded us all how powerful quiet strength can be." That day, I realized this wasn't just my comeback. It was my liberation. A month after the hearing, word got around that Dean had moved back in with his parents, into the same bedroom he grew up in, posters from high school still curling on the walls. Kelsey had dumped him, not with a bang, but with a quiet string of passive-aggressive Instagram posts about outgrowing toxic cycles and learning the hard way. Apparently, real life with Dean didn't match the fantasy she'd signed up for. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he tried to use his personal credit cards again, only to find most of them maxed out or closed. The lavish lifestyle he'd planned had disappeared like sand through his fingers, and no one was rushing to save him. Meanwhile, my boutique, my little shop, as he once belittled it, had never been busier. Orders were pouring in. A local lifestyle magazine reached out, wanting to feature my story. Not about the divorce, about the comeback. About how I built something lasting when the ground beneath me cracked open. What Dean didn't realize is that while he'd been chasing youth and attention, I'd been investing in something real, something with roots. My boutique wasn't just a store, it was a reflection of my values, my grit, my ability to endure and evolve. I'd hired 2 new employees, both women who had left difficult relationships and needed a fresh start. We worked together, side by side, rebuilding not just displays or inventory but confidence, trust, and purpose. The boutique became a quiet sanctuary for women like us, the kind who had been doubted, discarded, or underestimated. One afternoon, as I rearranged a display of new spring handbags, my assistant came in holding a gift bag and a small envelope. No return name. Inside was a card with a single line written in careful handwriting. "You didn't just survive, you taught us how to rise." I stood there, hand on my heart, tears threatening but never falling. Because it was true. I hadn't just made it through, I'd transformed everything he tried to break into something beautiful and whole. Dean thought he'd ended our story with that smug little text. What he didn't know, what men like him never seem to learn, is that when you underestimate a woman's strength, you don't just lose the battle. You hand her the pen to rewrite the ending. And I was just getting started. By the 1-year mark, my life no longer revolved around Dean or his debris. The boutique had expanded into a second location across town, and both stores were thriving. I'd built an online presence that was starting to gain national traction. Orders from Chicago, Denver, even a few from LA, which made me chuckle every time I printed those labels. But the biggest surprise came the afternoon Melissa walked into my flagship store. Yes, that Melissa. She looked different. Softer somehow. Less sure of herself. Like someone who had just come through the fire and wasn't quite sure what survived. She didn't make a scene. In fact, she walked right up to me, clutching her purse like it was a life preserver, and said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I kept my hands busy folding scarves. For what? She bit her lip, eyes glossy. For believing every lie he told me about you. That you were cold. Controlling, that you never supported his dreams. I thought I was helping him escape. Turns out I was just the next target. I didn't say anything right away. I let her sit with the truth. Eventually, I looked up and said, "Those weren't dreams, Melissa. They were excuses. There's a big difference." She nodded. Yeah. I figured that out 2 weeks into living with him. When he started asking me to take out a loan for a bigger apartment, then complained about the size of my closet. We stood there in a kind of silent understanding, two women who had been fed the same story, only from different angles. She didn't stay long, just enough to buy a handbag and say, "I hope you know you didn't just get out. You rose above it. I admire that." As she left, I watched her blend into the crowd on the sidewalk. No longer the wide-eyed girl who'd once giggled at Dean's cheap charm in an office holiday sweater. Now, just another woman learning how to recover from a mistake that wore expensive cologne and said all the right things until he didn't. That night, I sat alone in my office, a candle flickering beside my framed copy of his first cruel text. Above it, I'd added a new sign. Success isn't about proving him wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you are always right. And finally, I believed it. It was the 5-year anniversary of my boutique's grand opening, and the place was glowing. Candles in gold holders, soft jazz playing from the speakers, and shelves lined with everything from handmade clutches to limited edition scarves. Customers filtered in steadily, some long-time loyalists, others new faces drawn in by the buzz. I stood near the register, watching it all unfold with a quiet kind of pride. What once started as a single storefront, the little shop Dean mocked, had become a thriving brand with 3 locations, a full staff, and a community of women who supported each other fiercely. That night wasn't about Dean. It was about what came after him. Still, I should have known the past has a strange way of circling back. Just before closing, I saw her, Dean's mother, Dolores, walking through the door in one of our signature wrap dresses. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She waited until the crowd thinned before approaching me near the display table. "Savannah," she said softly, smoothing her skirt. "I wasn't sure you'd recognize me." "I did," I replied calmly, meeting her gaze. "Nice dress." "It's lovely," she said, glancing down. "One of your staff helped me pick it out last week." I didn't tell her who I was. "Probably for the best," I said. She paused, then added, "I saw Mark yesterday." She still called him by his middle name, what his family used when they wanted to pretend he was better than his choices. He was talking about his glory days, about how things could have been different. I told him he didn't lose everything in the divorce, he threw it away. For a second, I didn't know how to respond. There was no satisfaction in hearing that. No vindication. Just a cool, steady truth that had taken me 5 long years to live into. Dolores continued, "You taught all of us something about what happens when you stop making excuses for bad behavior." She looked down, then up again. "That's your legacy in this family, Savannah." When she left, I stood by the door a moment longer, letting the words settle. I didn't build my life to prove anyone wrong, but standing there, surrounded by the warmth, the light, the laughter of women who did see me, it hit me. Dean's text wasn't a full stop. It was a comma, and everything that followed was the story I wrote. A few weeks after the anniversary celebration, I was in my office organizing receipts when one of my newer employees, Melissa, oddly enough, knocked on the door. Not that Melissa. This one was 24, sharp, reliable, and completely unaware of the tangled history behind her name. She poked her head in and said, "Hey, Savannah? There's a customer asking for you by name." I assumed it was one of our regulars, maybe someone I'd styled for years. But when I stepped into the showroom, I found a young couple, no older than late 20s, standing near the accessories wall, clutching a worn leather planner and a copy of a small business handbook. The woman smiled nervously and said, "We saw your story in Women Who Lead. We just signed a lease for our first shop. We don't have anyone to ask for advice except you. You made it through hell and turned it into something beautiful." How did you do it? For a second, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I suddenly saw a younger version of myself in her eyes. That quiet desperation to get it right. The fear of falling behind. The hope that anyone might see you as capable. I smiled and led them toward the back, where we kept extra seating. I'll tell you everything I wish someone had told me, I said. But first, let me see that business plan. We talked for over an hour about vendor relationships, protecting your assets, keeping personal and business finances separate, and most of all, listening to your gut, even when others try to silence it. The woman scribbled notes, like her life depended on it. Before they left, she hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for not just surviving, but for showing the rest of us how to thrive." That night, I sat alone in the boutique long after closing, the soft glow of pendant lights casting shadows on the wall. I looked over at my framed memento, the very first message Dean had sent me, the one that started it all. "I'm leaving you." I emptied the account. "Good luck." Underneath it now hung a brass plaque, recently added. "You were the end of his chapter, but you are the author of your own book." And somehow, that truth, the one I'd earned through heartbreak and healing, was worth every page it took to write. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I stopped by the boutique early, a coffee in one hand and a manila folder of expansion plans in the other. I'd been working on a pitch to open a fourth location, this time in Charleston. The idea had started as a whisper, something I barely dared to speak out loud.
But now,
it felt like momentum.
Growth.
Freedom. As I unlocked the door, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, and the scent of jasmine from the planter boxes outside drifted in. I took a long sip of coffee, walked to my office, and glanced, as I always did, at the framed text message hanging above my desk. The one Dean sent 5 years ago that changed everything. "I'm leaving you." I emptied the account. "Good luck." I no longer read it with anger. These days, it reminded me of how far I'd come and how deeply he'd miscalculated what I was capable of. I sat down, opened my laptop, and began reviewing numbers. Halfway through my notes, an alert popped up, an email from Dean's old sister-in-law, Amanda. The subject line made me freeze. "Thought you should see this." I clicked. Attached was a screenshot of a post from Dean's new dating profile. He'd listed himself as an entrepreneur, bragged about helping build a successful boutique chain, and claimed he was looking for someone mature, but not too serious. The irony nearly made me spill my coffee. Helping build? Dean wouldn't know a profit margin if it slapped him with a receipt. But what stunned me more was the profile photo. It was old. Years old. Pre-divorce. He was still clinging to a version of himself that no longer existed and never really had. Instead of replying, I filed the screenshot in a folder labeled Loose Ends. I'd long since stopped letting Dean live rent-free in my head, but something about that post felt sad. Not threatening. Not insulting. Just pathetic. A man trying to rewrite his history, while the rest of us had long moved forward. Later that afternoon, I met with my general manager to walk through the new concept designs. As she laid out fabric swatches and logo mock-ups, I smiled. Not because everything had gone perfectly, but because I had built something that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Especially not his. Dean once thought he'd broken me. But the truth is, he freed me. And I had no intention of ever living small again. A few months after I finalized the lease for the Charleston location, an invitation arrived in the mail that made me pause. It wasn't formal or embossed, just a plain ivory card with black ink that read, "Reunion. Class of '99. Join us for a night of memories, reconnections, and what's next?" Tucked into the envelope was a sticky note with a scribbled message. "He's going to be there. Just thought you'd want a heads up." I hadn't seen Dean in person since the final court date 5 years ago, and the thought of sharing air with him again made my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with curiosity. What version of himself would he bring this time? The charismatic fraud? The fallen Romeo? Or just the man who walked away from a life he never truly understood?
I debated not going.
My life was full now, full of growth, of friendships, of a business that was no longer just mine, but something that gave other women purpose, too. But something about that note, that nudge from the universe, felt unfinished. So, I RSVP'd yes. I wore a navy silk jumpsuit that made me feel powerful and free, and when I walked into the event hall, heads turned, but not because I was loud or flashy. It was the kind of attention that comes when someone walks in knowing exactly who they are. Dean was already there, leaning awkwardly against the bar, still clinging to that old charm that had dulled with time. When he saw me, his smile faltered. I watched his eyes sweep over me, like he was trying to place me in the old script he used to control. But I wasn't playing that role anymore. "Savannah," he said cautiously, "you look different." "I am," I replied, calm and cool. "Different is good." We made small talk for a minute. He tried to casually mention his consulting work. I nodded politely. Then he asked, "Do you ever regret how it all ended?" I smiled, not bitter, not smug, just honest.
No, Dean.
Because it didn't end. It started. And with that, I walked away, not because I needed to, but because I could. As I stepped outside into the warm southern air, I realized something deeper than closure. Dean had written me off as a chapter, but I was always the whole damn book. 2 years after that reunion night, I found myself standing on the main stage of a women's entrepreneurship conference in Atlanta, spotlight warm on my skin. A quiet sea of faces watching, listening, waiting. The irony didn't escape me. Just 5 years ago, I was a woman silently clutching a phone in a boutique, reading a text that was meant to break me. "I'm leaving you." I emptied the account. "Good luck." And now, here I was, introduced as a keynote speaker, the founder of a 5-location brand, and someone who turned betrayal into a blueprint for resilience. I adjusted the microphone and began not with stats or sales numbers, but with the truth. 5 years ago, I was called dramatic for protecting my business, paranoid for keeping my finances separate, cold for preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. But today, I'm called smart, strategic, and, apparently, someone worth listening to. The room erupted in warm, knowing laughter. I scanned the crowd, so many women, so many untold stories written behind their eyes. Some looked angry, some looked inspired, but all of them understood what it meant to be underestimated and still rise. After the talk, a line formed. Dozens of women, some my age, others just starting out, wanted to share their own moments. One woman clutched my hand and said, "When I left my husband, I didn't have a plan. I had fear. But your story made me believe I could turn fear into something stronger." Another showed me a photo of the studio she'd opened last spring. "You helped me find the guts to do this," she said through tears. That night, in my hotel room, I sat barefoot on the balcony with a glass of wine and stared out over the city lights. I thought of all the ways Dean had tried to reduce me, to my age, to my so-called little shop, to someone who'd never survive without him. But it turned out, I didn't just survive, I outgrew every version of myself that ever believed I needed his approval to thrive. In my planner, tucked beneath next week's to-do list, was a sticky note I'd written the day after I got that breakup text. It simply said, "Make this count." I smiled as I traced over the words with my fingertip. And I knew, without a doubt, I already had.